So it's my pleasure to be here with Gabor Matè. Gabor is a best-selling author and internationally renowned expert on addiction, trauma, childhood development, ADHD, parenting, and the relationship between stress and illness. And two of my favorite books of his are In the Realm of the Hungry Ghosts, which is about addiction, and When the Body Says No, which is about the connection between stress and disease. And you can see here, I've posted up your book, Gabor, pretty well.
Where are you located?
Right now I'm in Toronto, Canada.
Toronto, okay, yeah, got it.
Yeah, it's a different cover, isn't it?
No, it's the Canadian cover. So I thought for some reason you were in New York. It doesn't matter.
Right. Got it. So thank you so much for being here. First of all, I was just wondering how you're doing. How has COVID-19 impacted you personally?
So in terms of my routine and my life, it hasn't really interfered with much because these 6 months had been dedicated completely to writing my new book.
Right.
So I had no travel, I had no speaking engagements scheduled. I cleared my calendar off everything. So for me, it has caused no disruption that way. Mm-hmm. At the same time, it's a strange era to be going through. The world just feels different all of a sudden. And that heaviness, sometimes I notice it in myself. A lot has to do with how much self-care I'm able to do, which I'm in a position to. So, you know, I missed not being able to go to the swimming pool, but I have my bicycle and elliptical machine, so I can take care of myself. And again, it hasn't caused a disruption, but at the same time, the general angst, I'm certainly aware of it. I have to say personally as well that looking back, there may be some questions about this whole thing was handled and whether everything was as necessary as we think it is. But for now, I think those questions have to be deferred until we can look back with some wisdom and some hindsight.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's hard to really know anything in this moment, but I think that all of us are having such a unique experience. Some of us, like you, I think, you're used to working at home. I know you're working on a book right now, so there isn't as much disrupted, but we're all feeling it. There's some people who are dealing with job loss and uncertainty. Other people, like my sisters, are working professionals who have kids at home, and there's people who are dealing with grief and illness. So, we're all struggling in such different ways. But I do feel like there's this collective trauma that we're all experiencing. And what I've heard is that so many of us are experiencing this, but we're actually not all super tapped into what's happening within us. And I hear a lot about how this doesn't feel real. Like it's almost like we're kind of in denial, even though we're experiencing so much change. So I was just wondering if you could, speak to that, just around how I don't think that people are actually able to name what's happening. They're not able to name this trauma.
Well, so first of all, the word trauma. I think we have to be careful how we use it. Pain, difficulty, disappointment, anxiety, loneliness, those are not trauma. Those are pain, anxiety, difficulty, loneliness.
Right.
Trauma is actually a wound. That's the Greek meaning of the word. And so some people will be traumatized by the pain, isolation, and disappointment that they're experiencing. Other people will not be traumatized by it. Mm-hmm. So having certain emotions, even very difficult emotions, is not the same as having trauma. Trauma results in a constriction, a limitation of who we were before the wound. It results in a difficulty being in the present moment. It causes a disconnection really within ourselves and between ourselves and others. So we will see how much trauma will have happened, but we'll only know in retrospect.
Right.
As far as the strangeness, people have a built-in, natural, programmed propensity and desire for contact and to be touched. And all of a sudden, that's just been taken away from us. So that's really hard for people. That's really part of our natural programming. Is to, you see somebody, you want to hug them, you want to be close to them. That's strange these days, and especially for people living in isolation who don't have partners that they're living with. So that's very, very difficult.
So yeah, so I just want to come back to something that you said about trauma, and I know trauma changes the brain, but how long do we need to be experiencing trauma before that happens? I grew up with a lot of trauma. I grew up in a home where there was physical and emotional abuse, and that it was very long lasting, and it resulted in PTSD. It may be short lived. Some people are not going to experience the same extent of challenge that other people have. So I'd be really curious to hear your thoughts on that. Like, at what point does it become trauma?
Well, Nelson Mandela spent how many years in an isolation cell, but he wasn't traumatized. So it's not a question of length. It's a question of who's experiencing it and with what mindset. And I think what's actually happening is that, and Viktor Frankl went through the concentration camps and he wasn't actually traumatized. Now, those are rare individuals. The real issue, I think, is who's experiencing it. And some people can be traumatized very quickly. There are people that can endure something for a long time and not be traumatized. This is not a moral distinction or a distinction of strength of character. I think it's a distinction of how much unresolved trauma did you bring into this situation.
Yeah.
So I think people that have trauma in them, but the ordinary way of life allowed them to cope, distract themselves. They could go to work, go to the pub, beat their lover, buy a new pair of shoes, whatever it took to distract themselves from unresolved feelings. Now that those opportunities have been strictly limited now. So it's going to bring up the trauma that you haven't resolved yet. So partly it depends on, largely I think it depends on who's experiencing it. Who's experiencing it and how much support they get. Like, are you able to talk about what you're experiencing? Is there somebody there to listen to it? Then you'll have disappointment and pain and loneliness, but you'll not necessarily be traumatized. Not what happens to us, it what happens inside us.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's, I like to say it's not about the experience, but it's our relationship with the experience.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. So, so, in your book, When the Body Says No, which is about the connection between stress and disease, it's very clear, like, the impact of stress that stress has on our physiology. So I'm just also curious, you were talking about self-care. What would your advice be to people right now who are going through stress and uncertainty? I mean, even if we wouldn't categorize it as trauma, this stress that we're experiencing can still really impact us physiologically. So how should we approach our mental and emotional health right now?
Well, again, it can be traumatic for some people. So all I'm saying is that we won't know till afterwards. But so no doubt it's stressful. So when you look at the triggers for stress, there are lack of information, uncertainty, loss of control, and conflict. Okay. Well, uncertainty, lack of information, loss of control. Boy, are we experiencing that in a big way. So a lot of people are experiencing a lot of stress. Not to mention a lot of people, economic uncertainty. Will their jobs be there when this is over? Will businesses survive? A lot of uncertainty right now. So the first thing is, if you look at it from a Buddhist psychological point of view, the Buddhists always talk about how everything is unpredictable, everything is always shifting. There's no certainty in the external world. So to some extent, we have to accept it. Can we be with the uncertainty? So, okay, I'm feeling anxiety about the uncertainty. Can I accept that I'm feeling the anxiety right now? Or do I want to suppress that anxiety or act it on somebody else or somewhat distract myself from it through drugs or excessive screen watching or whatever? Or can I just actually accept my feelings the way they are? I think that's important. Secondly, and that's not easy to do, because most of us in this society are not very well equipped to do that. We're mostly used to distracting ourselves, deferring the feeling to the future, really, rather than experiencing it in the present moment. Number one, can you put a routine into your life? Can you exercise? Can you do some deep breathing for 5 seconds or 1 minute, 5 times a day? Or if you have a more developed meditation practice, can you engage in that? Can you limit the amount of screen time so that the very screen effect on your brain isn't coming at you all your waking hours? In terms of how much information you need about your response to the COVID, how much time do you have to spend reading about it every day? Probably no more than 5 minutes. But how much time do you spend obsessing about what's happening here and there and reading all the news and listening to all the coverage? Well, that's crazy making, I think. So limit the screen time and limit the amount of energy you expend on engaging with this whole corona question. I mean, find out the information that you need, but beyond that, don't drive yourself crazy.
Yeah.
Well, it's obvious to emphasize the importance of taking care of your body at such a time, healthy eating and so on. If sing and dance if you can, beat on a drum. You know, these are age-old practices that people use to relieve and to deal with stress. You know, if you got friends on internet, make music together, have chats, just each of you speaking about how you're feeling. So engage with life as best you can under the circumstances. In most of Canada, it's perfectly permissible to go outdoors to get some exercise. And the weather, and the weather is getting that we can do it now. So
yeah.
This is not very profound advice, but really, what else can I tell you? Except again, allow yourself to fully experience what you're going through.
Yeah. And, you know, I actually heard, like, in terms of us kind of meeting the moment and meeting ourselves in the moment and feeling what our experience is without turning away to distraction and comfort. You know, as you suggested, it's a really difficult thing to do. And I actually heard in a recent interview that you did, you were asked, you know, how do we, when these difficult emotions come up, then what do we do with them? And you replied saying, how would you respond to a child if they came running to you with their suffering? You know, and the first thing that came to my mind was you would hold them. And, you know, we hold our pain, and we don't necessarily need to always do something with it, but we need to find a way to create space for our experience and to be with our experience. And, you know, one of the things that I've heard a lot of is people are reverting to binge eating a lot right now. And, you know, I'm not sure if you've heard a lot about addicts who are really struggling right now. You know, I'd love to hear about your advice for those who are struggling with addictions at this time.
Well, I'm not working as a doctor anymore, so I'm not clinically involved in medical care. But I do hear that drug use is going up. There were more overdoses last week in Vancouver, for example, than in recent times. Domestic violence is up. That's what I was saying before. Wouldn't be surprised if binging is up. In other words, when people lose their usual coping mechanisms, then all their unresolved trauma will show up, and then they'll desperately try to suppress the pain. And binge eating is a way to suppress pain. It's not an eating problem, it's a pain problem. Drug use is not a drug problem, it's a pain problem. People are trying to suppress their pain. You know, I don't want to say anything that will perceive anybody as being judged. John Lennon had this song once, whatever gets you through the night. You know, if you need to be, I would say to somebody who's binge eating, listen, if you need to binge eat, but do it consciously.
Mm-hmm.
Say to yourself, I got too much stress, pain, anxiety right now. I can't abide it. I can't handle it. I'm going to binge eat, and then binge eat consciously and enjoy it. You know, so now, if you can be with the pain and the anxiety and not have to indulge in your habit, so much the better.
Mm-hmm.
But if you can't, don't feel guilty about it. Don't make yourself wrong. Give yourself permission.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's great advice. You know, I actually used to have an eating disorder when I was young, for about 10 years, between age 14 and 24. And mindfulness is really what healed me. And it was compassion specifically. It was changing the way I responded to my habits, and creating that, you know, that kind of gentle response in those moments changed my relationship with myself and with food. So yeah,
Well,
so much is.
you know, I'm just talking with a person who, I won't say much more detail, but she's just been committed to a facility because of her eating disorder. And I'd love to talk to you, maybe interview you for my book, because I'm going to write about eating disorder in my book. And I know this is a bit off topic now, but I don't see eating disorder as sort of a disease as such. I actually see it as a coping mechanism. And you already mentioned the trauma that you went through. So I'd love to hear and interview you about just your relationship to that eating disorder and how you turned it around.
Absolutely.
Because I'm sure you didn't do it inside the usual medical model.
I did not.
Yeah.
I did not. And yeah, we can talk about that later. But yeah, I did. I had a experience working with many different therapists. I was in the hospital for a while, and it was really mindfulness that healed me in my practice.
Well, I look
Yeah.
forward
So
to that. Sometime we'll talk about that.
Okay. Yeah, happy to. I'm happy to. May I ask one last question?
Of course.
Okay. So, there's so much challenge around all of this, but I actually really see opportunities for personal and social and global change. And, again, we have no idea how this is going to play out. And I also know that it's our instinct to be drawn towards what's comfortable, what we know, which always isn't necessarily what's good for us. But in the ideal, in your ideal world, what are your hopes? What are you hoping that this pandemic could lead to in terms of, what would that better world look like?
Well, it might be a bit of a cliche to say this again, but the Chinese Enneagram or the Chinese anagram symbol for crisis is made up of two concepts: danger and opportunity. And so there's danger here, but there's also an opportunity. So there's an opportunity for learning. Now, some learning maybe is obvious already. Did we not just realize all of a sudden that the world is one, that we're all connected? Now, when was that never true? But now now it's actually right in front of us. So maybe we can learn that lesson. And how would we live our lives, and how would we conduct our politics and our economics and our culture with the deep realization that we're all one, that it's all connected? Number one. Number two, let's be honest about it. We can say that we're all in this together, but we're not all in together the same way. People who are poor, who are under more stress, who because of the stress, their immune system is more run down, they're at a much higher risk. So if you look at the United States statistics, the number of deaths due to COVID are disproportionately distributed among the Black American population. Why? Because they're under stress all the time. Their immune system is under assault. And this is not just showing up now. They have higher rates of death from breast cancer and prostate cancer and everything else. Why aren't we paying attention to those facts all the time? Why aren't we paying attention now? So I think there's already many lessons that we could be deriving even as we move along. And so if you ask me what my hope is, well, I think there's a real possibility here for deep learning. I also believe that this society is designed not to learn. It's designed to escape and distract and to go back to the ways of control and inequality and really injustice that always characterize it. We have an opportunity to really see what that means in practice now. Will we learn the lessons? Will we learn the lesson of unity? I think some people will, but I don't think that's an outcome I can automatically hope for.
Yeah, I mean, I think the hope is that enough people awaken, and in every challenge there is an opportunity. And so, I guess my hope is that enough of us, enough of us have enough of an awakening that we can hold strong and come together, and slowly change will happen. I think it's going to be slow, but I'm hopeful in some regards that this is going to lead to some positive outcomes.
Well, the way I relate to that is I always have that hope, I mean, because these lessons, even though they're very dramatic, they're not new. They've been, so we haven't learned them yet, not as a society. So the real question is for each of us is, well, what can we learn each of us individually? And not so much what we're hoping for, but what can we actually learn individually? And then how can we translate that learning into our lives? I think that's a more realistic question.
I love that. Yeah. Thank you so much. This was such a pleasure to spend time with you and offer your wisdom. I have so much to learn from you, and I'm just really grateful for your time.